I would say that basically, in terms of actually raising awareness, what is true of almost all of the things of Rio, in terms of raising people's awareness of the importance of biodiversity, I think we've been very successful. In terms of actually getting countries to protect biodiversity through protected areas and other measures, I would say I would give 50% marks. We're probably halfway there. We need to go. But there are some very bright spots, like the conservation of the Amazon. That was sort of really started in Rio and took off in Johannesburg in 2002. And one is amazed at the sheer size of the area that has been put under protection now in the Amazon in a very sensible way. I think the big change that I see is the way in which the message of integration of Rio is registering. So people don't just say biodiversity, they say ecosystem services. Worry about biodiversity because it matters for the ecosystem services that you want. Protect trees because not just because a tree is a very valuable thing, a good thing, but also because that tree is doing things for you in terms of holding water, in terms of holding soil. And that I think are the positive features on this area of the Convention on Biodiversity. So I'm sure that's what you want me to comment on. I'm not going to say too much on the desertification side or the climate side, because that's a different story. In some ways, I would say the progress has been slower in the other conventions, and biodiversity has probably made a little more progress than the others.
In terms of public awareness, I guess climate change is always going to be up there. Well, it is up there at the moment, at least, as the big issue that's in the newspapers the whole time. Why do you think that biodiversity perhaps has not had the same profile as climate change?
I would say the big difference is this, that in the case of climate change, people see it as a threat to them, including a threat to their health. In the case of biodiversity, the message is the other way around. You are a threat. Now that's always much more difficult. It's always much more easier to get interest a person in something that is going to affect that person directly, rather than interest a person in what that person is doing which is affecting something else. So that's part of the reason for this asymmetry. At the same time, I would say that biodiversity touches on something which is probably closer to people's heart. A panda, a beautiful tree, a beautiful landscape is something everybody responds to. Whereas climate change is much more, I would say, abstract idea. It's not something that you see out there which is going to hit you. Whereas biodiversity is something that you can see, and in some ways, it actually does. You take children. It's going to be much easier if you go to a school to talk about tigers, to talk about the panda, to talk about trees, rather than to go and talk to them about climate. So I'd say it's a mixed story. Yes, it's true. People worry more about climate. They worry less about biodiversity. But I suspect this is because they don't see the loss of biodiversity as a threat in the same way as they see climate as a threat.
And when these three conventions were created back in '92, the term common but differentiated responsibility was sort of ingrained in their souls, for want of a better concept. Many people are now saying that this is holding the talks back. This is holding negotiations back because you have this imaginary split, this real split between the developed and developing world. So, looking back, do you feel it was a mistake to include that phrase?
I don't think it was a mistake, because I think it reflects something which is very real. Because it's a question of what you base the common but differentiated responsibility on. Certainly, common but differentiated responsibility in terms of capacity has to be there. If you are going to ask a rich person and a poor person to do exactly the same amount of work in order to protect a community, then you will fail. You must differentiate between the rich person and the poor person in terms of the responsibility you cast on them. The guy with the big house and the guy with the small house, for the responsibility you cast on them for looking after the, if you like, the environmental health of a community. That's common but differentiated responsibility. It's a differentiation based on capacity. A more difficult issue is differentiation based on culpability. You must do more because you caused the problem. Now there we have difficulties because people say, have not fully accepted the idea. Though in law, when you talk of a polluter pays principle, it is essentially a responsibility on the basis of culpability. And if you accept the polluter pays principle, as most legal systems do, then you have to accept the idea of that there must be a link between responsibility and culpability. And since culpability is differentiated, so is responsibility. So in that sense, you cannot run away from the idea. It's not good. If you ever were to try and solve these problems at a community level or at a global level without recognizing differentiation on the basis of capacity, you will fail. If you try and get an agreement without be willing to recognize differentiation on the basis of capacity, you will fail. So if you want an agreement and if you want action, then the idea of common but differentiated responsibility is absolutely necessary at the community or at the global level. So I don't think it is at all a mistake. It's simply a matter of spelling out what the differentiated part is and what the common part is.
Is it important that there is some flexibility over that in terms of which countries' capacities? Because clearly now we're seeing there's an economic crisis and emerging economies are faring better than what we might term the traditional developed economies. So does there have to be some flexibility in when we come to asking people for money?
I think that certain amount of flexibility will come and has come and is probably certainly unavoidable. And one could certainly have an interesting discussion on how to spell out the differentiation. But you cannot say no differentiation. You cannot say that somebody who has a level of emissions which are 4, 5, 10 times more than another country on per capita terms should have the same structure of commitments as a country with low emissions. That's not feasible. So I would say that it is possible to have a meaningful discussion on how the differentiation should take place, but not to jettison the idea of common but differentiated responsibility. And in that process, you may well find that there will be some obligations which will fall on people on whom no such obligation has fallen so far. That's possible, but it cannot be at the cost of obligations on the people who are substantially responsible for the problem. Really, let's be very frank. The reason we are running into this problem is because the Western countries who are supposed to do something have failed. They have failed to meet their goals and targets in many key areas, in emission reductions, in financial support, for instance, you see, or technology transfer, 3 key areas. That's the reason why we run into the problem. And you can't go around and say, look, I know I can't do more as much as I can claim to, but you better start doing more. That's the difficulty.
There were many people after the last Rio Plus 20 summit just a few months ago who said this was the end of multilateralism. This proved that countries cannot now work together because everyone has such individual and aims based upon their own sort of state views and state desires. What would be your sort of view on that? How did you see the Rio talks, and were they the disaster many people painted them to be?
I wouldn't call it a disaster. I would say that I was also disappointed. I would have expected to see more. But we have if in many of these things, problems which are inherently global, like climate, you have no route out other than multilateralism. The idea that you let the big players solve problems is, to me, misleading. My problem is the big players. I don't have a problem with the small players. It's the big guys who are causing me problems in getting an agreement. So if somebody says, no, your problem is you've got too many small guys roiling the works. No, it's the big guys who are roiling the works. So I'm very happy to have a large process, but at least there's some pressure on the big guys from the small island states, the least developed countries, the smaller African countries, to say, look, this is our life. You guys better do something about it. And that's, to me, quite valuable. So I'd say that the multilateral process is flawed, but is absolutely necessary, because without that you will not get these agreements. What you'll get is very inadequate agreements amongst the big players on, okay, you do this, we do this, and we tell the world we've done a wonderful job. That won't work. That should not work. And fortunately, we have a very vigorous global civil society which will make sure that won't work.
The Montreal Protocol is often taken as this beacon of what an effective environmental treaty should look like. Why do you think that succeeded, and attempts further down the line to develop similar treaties to look after certain elements of the earth, why do you think they have failed?
I think partly because we tend to forget that the Montreal Protocol was essentially solve the problem through a technological fix. Nobody had to use pure refrigerators. No country had to cut down on the number of refrigerators or air conditioners they had. It was simply a matter of replacing one refrigerant by another. There was a technological fix available. No big issue was involved in terms of lifestyles, etc. There was a small issue of compensating countries for the transition, and that got resolved because the amounts involved in that were also not mega bucks. So I think that's a very special case where a simple technological fix allowed you to tackle the problem. We have no such simple fix available in other areas. And therefore, it's going to be much more difficult. And we cannot escape the fact that in many of these other areas, the discussion cannot be a narrow, segmented discussion, as in the case of ozone, but has to be embedded in a broader discussion of sustainable development. You can't talk climate change without talking of the rest of the pattern of development. You can't talk biodiversity protection without talking about the pattern of development. You can't talk about desertification without talking about development. And that's the big difference. But I can't talk about ozone as a pure, simple technological fix. I can give you more reasons for it. The whole thing happened because DuPont had the technology. It's very interesting that it was stoutly resisted till they had the technology.
When you talk about these being cross-cutting issues, in retrospect, was it a mistake to have 3 conventions with their own particular ambitions and aims, and not just have one big convention focusing on those key environmental issues?
I think it would have been very difficult to get hard obligations with a big convention. If you wanted hard obligations, you would have had to have some precision. And in the case of climate with the Kyoto Protocol, you tried to get into hard obligations. And you could not do that in a vague, generalized convention on sustainable development. So I don't think a portmanteau convention on sustainable development would have worked.